In the deepest hours of winter's night, when frost writes ancient runes across darkened windows and the aurora dances like spirits across northern skies, we journey into the most unforgiving mythological landscape ever conceived by human imagination. Tonight, let yourself drift into the world of Norse mythology, where gods knew they were doomed to die, where heroes chose glory over survival, and where even the wisest beings understood that all knowledge came at a price too terrible to contemplate. There's no need to hurry through these twilight tales, no need to grasp every divine name or cosmic battle. Simply allow the stories to unfold like the slow wheel of seasons in lands where winter lasts for months, and forget about time completely. These myths emerged from 2 millennia of northern consciousness, wrestling with questions that southern mythologies rarely dared to ask. What happens when the gods themselves are mortal? When wisdom requires sacrifice of what we love most? And when the very act of seeking knowledge ensures our eventual destruction? Settle back, breathe deeply, and prepare to witness mythology's darkest and most psychologically complex vision of existence. The ancient voices await in the shadows between ice and fire, Odin hanging from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, Loki bound beneath a serpent's dripping venom, Balder falling to a mistletoe dart guided by cunning malice, and countless others whose stories shaped a culture that understood beauty and doom as inseparable companions. The Norse mythological imagination began not with creation but with endings, not with birth, but with the knowledge of inevitable death that shadowed every moment of divine and mortal existence. Unlike other mythological systems that promised eventual triumph of good over evil or cycles of eternal renewal, the Norse cosmos was heading toward Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, and everyone, from the highest deity to the humblest human, knew it. This fundamental pessimism created the most psychologically sophisticated approach to heroism, wisdom, and meaning that the ancient world ever produced. The Norse gods were not immortal beings dispensing justice from positions of unassailable power, but mortal figures facing their own destruction with whatever dignity and courage they could muster. Their knowledge of their fate did not paralyze them, but rather freed them to act with a desperate nobility that gave their choices cosmic significance. Odin, the All-Father whose name meant fury or ecstasy, embodied this tragic wisdom more completely than any other mythological figure. His insatiable hunger for knowledge drove him to sacrifice his eye for a drink from Mimir's well of wisdom, to hang himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights pierced by his own spear, to discover the secrets of the runes, and to constantly seek prophecies that only confirmed what he already knew, that he and all he loved were doomed to perish when the end came. The psychological complexity of Odin's character transcended simple archetypes of divine authority to present a figure whose wisdom came through suffering, whose power was purchased with loss, and whose foreknowledge of catastrophe made every moment of existence both precious and terrible. He was simultaneously creator and destroyer, protector and betrayer, the wisest of beings and the most tormented by that very wisdom. His transformation from whatever earlier sky god he might have been into the complex figure we encounter in the surviving sources reflected centuries of Northern European meditation on the nature of authority, knowledge, and mortality. The Odin who emerged in the medieval Icelandic sources was not a comfortable father figure, but a dangerous wanderer whose gifts came with prices that recipients might not understand until it was too late to refuse them. The ravens Hugin and Munin, who served as Odin's eyes and ears throughout the 9 worlds, represented thought and memory, the twin faculties that enabled consciousness to extend beyond immediate sensory experience into the realms of reflection, anticipation, and tragic understanding. Each morning these birds flew forth to gather information about all that transpired in the cosmos, returning each evening to whisper their findings into their master's ears. But Odin feared that one day his ravens might not return, that thought and memory themselves might abandon him, leaving him isolated within immediate experience without the broader perspective that enabled wisdom and strategic planning. This fear of cognitive dissolution, of losing the very faculties that made him who he was, added psychological depth to his character that distinguished Norse mythology from traditions that treated divine consciousness as unproblematic and eternal. His 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, born from Loki's shape-shifting liaison with the giant stallion Svadilfari, could travel between the worlds of the living and the dead, carrying Odin on journeys that no other being could undertake. This supernatural mount was not merely a means of transportation, but a symbol of consciousness's ability to navigate between different states of existence, different levels of reality, and different temporal dimensions. The spear Gungnir that never missed its target, and the ring Draupnir that produced 8 identical gold rings every 9th night, represented divine power that operated through precision and abundance respectively. But even these magical artifacts could not alter the fundamental trajectory toward Ragnarok. They were tools that enabled Odin to fulfill his cosmic role more effectively, but could not change the essential nature of that role or its ultimate futility. Loki, whose name possibly meant fire, and whose nature embodied the principle of creative destruction, served as both companion and nemesis to the gods, friend and enemy, problem solver and problem creator. His psychology defied simple moral categories, making him perhaps mythology's most complex trickster figure, a being whose very existence was necessary for cosmic balance, but whose actions inevitably led to cosmic destruction. The early stories presented Loki as a valuable member of the divine community, using his shape-shifting abilities and clever schemes to recover stolen treasures, escape from impossible situations, and obtain magical objects that enhance the gods' power and security. His quick thinking and willingness to take risks that other gods would not consider made him indispensable for solving crises that conventional divine wisdom could not address. But the same qualities that made Loki useful in emergencies also made him dangerous in ordinary circumstances. His inability to respect boundaries, his compulsive need to challenge authority, and his delight in creating chaos for its own sake gradually transformed him from helpful ally to existential threat. The gods' growing unease with his unpredictability created tensions that would eventually explode in catastrophic violence. The binding of Loki after his orchestration of Baldur's death created one of mythology's most psychologically disturbing images of divine justice and its consequences. The gods' decision to torture their former companion by chaining him beneath a serpent whose venom dripped constantly onto his face was both cosmic necessity and moral corruption. They preserved the world temporarily but violated their own principles in ways that guaranteed their eventual destruction. Loki's wife Sigyn, who remained loyal despite his crimes and held a bowl to catch the serpent's venom, represented devotion so complete that it transcended moral judgment. Her periodic need to empty the bowl, during which the venom burned Loki's face and caused his thrashing to shake the earth in earthquakes, created a rhythm of torment that connected divine punishment with geological phenomena. The psychological implications of this eternal torture were profound and disturbing. The gods who bound Loki were transformed by their actions from protectors of cosmic order into perpetrators of endless cruelty, while Loki's suffering gradually consumed whatever remained of his capacity for positive relationship with his former companions. The binding ensured that when Ragnarok came, his anger would be pure and his desire for revenge total. Thor, whose name meant thunder, and whose massive hammer Mjolnir could level mountains, and whose strength exceeded that of all other gods, represented divine masculine power in its most direct and uncomplicated form. His battles against giants, monsters, and forces of chaos made him the most popular deity among ordinary people who needed protection from hostile powers beyond their ability to control or comprehend. The psychological appeal of Thor lay partly in his relative simplicity, compared to the complex motivations and tragic wisdom of Odin or the dangerous unpredictability of Loki. Thor's solutions to problems usually involved the direct application of overwhelming force, and his moral universe was structured by clear distinctions between friends and enemies, order and chaos, protection and destruction. But this simplicity concealed its own form of tragic awareness. Thor knew that his strength, however great, was not infinite, and that the forces he fought would eventually overwhelm him. His prophesied mutual destruction with the world serpent Jormungandr during Ragnarok represented the ultimate futility of physical power against cosmic entropy and dissolution. The relationship between Thor and Loki, travelling companions whose adventures often required both brute force and cunning intelligence, embodied the necessary but unstable alliance between order and chaos, strength and cleverness, conventional virtue and creative transgression. Their friendship, however strained by Loki's increasingly destructive behaviour, represented the psychological integration of opposing principles that enabled divine society to function until the final crisis made such integration impossible. The hammer Mjolnir itself possessed psychological significance that extended beyond its function as a weapon. its ability to return to Thor's hand after being thrown, its power to consecrate marriages and births, and its role in maintaining the boundary between the ordered world of gods and humans and the chaotic realm of giants, made it a symbol of reliability, sacred authority, and cosmic stability in a universe heading toward inevitable dissolution. Frigg, Odin's wife and queen of the gods, whose name meant beloved and whose domain included marriage, motherhood, and domestic harmony, represented divine feminine wisdom that operated through love, intuition, and the protective instincts that drove mothers to shield their children from harm, regardless of cosmic law or divine decree. Her unsuccessful attempt to save her son Balder by extracting promises from all things not to harm him demonstrated both the power and the limitations of maternal love. Her systematic approach to protecting Balder showed divine intelligence operating through emotional rather than analytical means. But her oversight of the seemingly harmless mistletoe plant proved that even the most careful planning could not account for every possibility. The psychological complexity of her position as Queen of Gods, who were themselves mortal, created unique stresses and responsibilities that distinguished Norse divine femininity from other mythological traditions. She had to maintain dignity and authority while watching those she loved march toward destruction she was powerless to prevent, creating a form of tragic nobility that resonated throughout the mythological literature. Her ability to travel freely between the different worlds and her knowledge of fate, which she possessed but never revealed, made her a figure of mysterious wisdom who understood more than she could act upon. This knowledge without power created psychological tensions that reflected the human condition writ large. The awareness of mortality and limitation combined with the emotional investment in others' welfare that made such knowledge painful rather than merely abstract. Balder, whose name meant bold or bright, and whose beauty and goodness made him beloved by all beings except Loki, represented the principle of innocent perfection that could not survive in a cosmos dominated by conflict and approaching dissolution. His dreams of his own death, which began the sequence of events leading to Ragnarok, suggested that even perfect goodness carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The psychological sophistication of the Balder myth lay in its recognition that innocence and perfection were not sustainable in a morally complex universe. Balder's very goodness made him vulnerable to Loki's malice, while his universal popularity created the conditions that enabled his destruction to have cosmic rather than merely personal consequences. The gods' reaction to Balder's prophetic dreams, their decision to extract promises from all things not to harm him, demonstrated how love could lead to actions that seemed protective but actually created new vulnerabilities. Their systematic approach to ensuring Balder's safety left him in a position where the one thing they overlooked could destroy him completely. The mistletoe dart that killed Balder, guided by Loki's hand but thrown by the blind god Herder, represented the principle that destruction often came through seemingly insignificant means and innocent agents. Herder's blindness made him both victim and perpetrator, while Loki's manipulation transformed natural fraternal affection into an instrument of cosmic catastrophe. The aftermath of Balder's death, the gods' unsuccessful attempt to ransom him from Hel, the binding of Loki, and the beginning of the final countdown to Ragnarok demonstrated how single actions could have consequences that extended far beyond their immediate effects. Balder's death was simultaneously personal tragedy and cosmic turning point, individual loss and universal catastrophe. The world tree Yggdrasil, whose name meant Odin's horse, and which connected the 9 worlds of Norse cosmology, represented the axis around which all existence revolved, and the living symbol of cosmic order that even Ragnarok could not completely destroy. Its roots extended into the wells of fate, wisdom, and primordial chaos, while its branches supported the realms where gods, humans, giants, elves, and other beings pursued their destinies. The psychological significance of Yggdrasil extended beyond its cosmological function to embody the principle of connection and separation that characterized Norse understanding of reality. The tree linked all the worlds while also maintaining their distinctiveness, enabled travel between realms while also preserving their individual integrity, and provided cosmic stability while also serving as the site of Odin's self-sacrificial quest for wisdom. The creatures that inhabited Yggdrasil, the eagle at its crown, the dragon Nidhöggr gnawing at its roots, the stags feeding on its branches, and the squirrel Ratatoska carrying messages between the eagle and dragon, represented the various forces that maintained cosmic balance through their ongoing interactions and conflicts. Each creature served essential functions while also contributing to the tensions that would eventually culminate in the tree's destruction and renewal. The wells beneath Yggdrasil's roots provided access to different forms of cosmic knowledge and power. Urda's well, where the Norns determined fate, offered insight into the past, present, and future that could not be changed but needed to be understood. Mimir's well provided wisdom purchased through sacrifice, while Hvergelmir, the primordial spring, represented the source from which all existence emerged and to which it would return. The psychology of fate that dominated Norse mythological thinking was not simple determinism, but complex recognition that consciousness operated within patterns and limitations that could be understood and worked with but never completely transcended. The Norns who wove the threads of destiny were not arbitrary tyrants, but cosmic principles that maintained universal order through their systematic attention to the consequences of actions and choices. The three Norns, Urda, past, Verdandi, present, and Skuld, future, represented temporal consciousness that enabled beings to understand their position within larger patterns of meaning and consequence. Their daily watering of Yggdrasil's roots with sacred water and white clay maintained the cosmic order, while also acknowledging that such maintenance was temporary, and that even their efforts could not prevent the eventual dissolution of the world they tended. The concept of wyrd, or fate, that permeated Norse culture was not passive acceptance of predetermined outcomes, but active engagement with the patterns that shaped existence. Understanding one's fate enabled more effective action within the constraints and possibilities that defined individual circumstances, while ignorance of fate led to choices that worked against rather than with the fundamental structures of reality. The heroic response to fate that characterized Norse ideals involved neither acceptance nor rebellion, but a third alternative: choosing how to meet one's destiny with whatever dignity, courage, and style one could muster. The knowledge that defeat was inevitable did not diminish heroic action, but rather gave it cosmic significance by demonstrating that consciousness could maintain its integrity even in the face of absolute limitation. The human heroes whose stories were preserved in the Volsung saga and related sources exemplified this heroic response to fate, while also exploring the psychological costs and moral complexities that accompanied such responses. These figures lived within the same cosmos as the gods, subject to the same limitations and heading towards similar forms of doom, but their mortality made their choices both more desperate and more meaningful. Sigurd the Volsung, known in German tradition as Siegfried, represented heroic excellence that achieved legendary status through actions that were simultaneously glorious and self-destructive. His slaying of the dragon Fafnir, his awakening of the Valkyrie Brynhild, and his tragic involvement in the politics of the Burgundian court created narrative patterns that influenced European literature for centuries. The psychological complexity of Sigurd's character emerged from the tension between his supernatural abilities, enhanced by bathing in dragon's blood, and his very human vulnerabilities to deception, passion, and the manipulations of others who sought to use his strength for their own purposes. His innocence about political intrigue made him simultaneously admirable and dangerous, noble and naive. The relationship between Sigurd and Brynhild created one of mythology's most psychologically devastating love stories, exploring how passion could transcend ordinary moral categories, while also demonstrating how such transcendence could lead to consequences that destroyed everyone involved. Their mutual recognition and love, constrained by oaths and political necessities they could not control, represented the cosmic principle that the highest forms of human connection were often impossible to sustain within social and temporal limitations. Brynhild's transformation from wise Valkyrie to vengeful queen, driven by her discovery that she had been deceived into marrying Gunnar while believing she was fulfilling her destined union with Sigurd, demonstrated how knowledge could destroy what ignorance had made bearable. Her decision to arrange Sigurd's death rather than continue living with the truth of their situation represented a form of tragic heroism that chose destruction over compromise. The curse that followed the Nibelung treasure from its dragon guardian Fafnir through successive owners demonstrated how material wealth, however magically potent, could not provide lasting security or happiness, but rather created new forms of vulnerability and conflict. Each attempt to possess and control the treasure led to violence, betrayal, and destruction that spread beyond the immediate participants to affect entire communities and future generations. The psychological insight embedded in these treasure curses reflected Norse understanding of how wealth and power created dependencies and conflicts that ultimately proved self-defeating. The gold that promised freedom and security instead created new forms of bondage and insecurity, while the power that seemed to solve problems instead generated new and more dangerous difficulties. The Valkyries, who served Odin by choosing which warriors would die in battle and escorting the chosen slain to Valhalla, represented divine feminine power operating within the sphere of war and death rather than the more familiar domains of love and nurture. These supernatural women embodied the principle that death was not evil, but necessary transition, not punishment, but honour for those who met it courageously in service of worthy causes. The psychology of the Valkyries reflected Norse understanding of how consciousness could be transformed by proximity to death and violence. Their ability to move freely between battlefields and the halls of the gods, their knowledge of fate combined with their role in implementing it, and their complex relationships with mortal heroes, created figures who embodied the intersection of beauty and terror, love and death, wisdom and warfare. Brynhild's status as a Valkyrie before her punishment and transformation into a mortal woman added layers of tragic irony to her story. Her original function as an agent of divine will conflicted with her personal desires and loyalties, creating moral dilemmas that had no satisfactory resolution. Her punishment for disobedience, being placed in enchanted sleep until awakened by a fearless hero, transformed her from active agent to passive victim, but her awakening restored her agency in ways that proved destructive for everyone involved. The Einherjar, warriors chosen for death in battle, who spent eternity in Valhalla preparing for the final battle of Ragnarok, represented Norse understanding of how individual achievement could serve cosmic purposes that transcended personal survival or happiness. Their daily battles and nightly feasts created a vision of afterlife that was neither reward nor punishment but continued service to divine purposes that would ultimately prove futile. The psychological appeal of this warrior afterlife lay partly in its acknowledgement that the qualities that made individuals valuable in life, courage, loyalty, skill in battle, would continue to be relevant after death. The Einherjar were not transformed by death into different kinds of beings, but remained themselves while serving larger purposes that gave their existence ongoing meaning and significance. But the Einherjar's knowledge that their final battle would end in defeat and destruction created existential tensions that distinguished Norse afterlife concepts from more optimistic mythological traditions. They prepared for Ragnarok not because they expected to win, but because the preparation itself had value, because their resistance to cosmic entropy had cosmic significance regardless of its ultimate futility. Valhalla itself, the Hall of the Slain where the Einherjar dwelt, represented Norse idealization of masculine social space, organized around the values of courage, loyalty and martial excellence. The constant feasting and fighting that characterized life in Valhalla created an environment where warriors could achieve the perfect integration of pleasure and purpose that was rarely possible in ordinary mortal existence. But Valhalla was also a place of waiting, of preparation for an end that everyone knew was coming. The hall's golden shields and spear-wielded warriors, its mead benches and boar meat, created beauty and abundance that were consciously temporary, precious because they were doomed rather than despite their doom. The concept of Ragnarok, the twilight or fate of the gods, represented mythology's most unflinching examination of the relationship between order and entropy, creation and destruction, meaning and futility. Unlike other mythological systems that promise cyclical renewal or ultimate triumph of good over evil, Norse mythology presented a cosmos heading toward definitive ending that would consume gods and humans alike. The signs that would herald the beginning of Ragnarok, the Fimbul winter that would last 3 years without summer, the breakdown of social and moral order, the escape of the wolf Fenrir and the dragon Nidugga, the ringing of the horn Gjallarhorn to summon the gods to their final battle, created a detailed eschatology that mapped the stages of cosmic dissolution with psychological as well as physical precision. The psychological sophistication of the Ragnarok narrative lay in its recognition that endings were not arbitrary external impositions, but natural consequences of the tensions and contradictions inherent in existence itself. The forces that would destroy the cosmos were not foreign invaders, but aspects of cosmic order that had been suppressed or constrained and would eventually assert themselves with overwhelming power. The mutual destruction that would characterize the final battles. Odin devoured by the wolf Fenrir, who would then be killed by Vidar, Thor and the world serpent Jormungandr slaying each other, Freyr falling to Surtur, whose fire would consume the world, created a vision of ending that was simultaneously catastrophic and balanced, destructive and just. The few survivors of Ragnarök, including Baldur and Hyrda returning from the dead, Vidar and Vali among the gods, Lif and Lifthrasir among humans, suggested that destruction was not complete annihilation but transformation that preserved something essential while eliminating what had become corrupt or unsustainable. The new world that would emerge from the ashes of the old would be both familiar and renewed, continuous and different. The psychological impact of this mythological vision on Norse culture created approaches to life, death, and meaning that emphasized present choice and action over future reward or security. Knowing that everything was temporary made individual decisions more significant rather than less, since they could not be justified by appeal to eternal consequences or ultimate vindication. The archaeological evidence for Norse religious practices and beliefs, while fragmentary and sometimes difficult to interpret, provides material confirmation for many aspects of the mythological narratives preserved in medieval Icelandic sources. Burial goods, ritual deposits, temple foundations, and runic inscriptions demonstrate that the cosmic vision embodied in the myths was not merely literary creation, but lived religious reality for Scandinavian communities across many centuries. The ship burials found throughout Scandinavia, from the elaborate royal interments at Gokstad and Oseberg to simpler boat graves in regional cemeteries, demonstrate material investment in beliefs about death as journey rather than ending, and about the continuation of individual identity in forms that required appropriate equipment and provisions for successful transition to otherworldly existence. The weapon sacrifices deposited in bogs and lakes throughout northern Europe suggest ritual practices that acknowledge divine authority over the tools of war while also demonstrating community willingness to surrender valuable resources in exchange for divine protection and favour. These deposits often included the finest weapons available, suggesting that the gods deserved the best rather than merely what humans could spare. The bracteates and other gold objects decorated with runic inscriptions and mythological images provide evidence for the integration of mythological consciousness with daily life and personal identity. These items served both practical functions as jewellery or currency, and symbolic functions as connections to divine power and protection. The runic inscriptions found on stones, weapons, jewellery, and other objects throughout the Norse cultural area demonstrate the practical application of Odin's gift of runic wisdom to human concerns ranging from memorial commemoration to magical protection to simple identification of ownership. The runes served simultaneously as writing system and magical technology, practical tool and sacred mystery. The temple complexes excavated at sites like Uppsala in Sweden and Borg in Norway reveal architectural sophistication that could accommodate large-scale religious gatherings, while also providing appropriate settings for the ritual activities that maintained relationships between human communities and divine powers. These buildings represented substantial community investment in religious infrastructure that supported both regular observances and special occasions. The influence of Norse mythological themes on medieval Scandinavian literature created narrative traditions that preserved and transmitted mythological consciousness, while also adapting it to serve contemporary concerns and Christian theological frameworks. The Icelandic sagas, while primarily concerned with human rather than divine characters, operated within cosmic and moral frameworks derived from traditional mythological understanding. The Elder Edda and Younger Edda, preserved in medieval Icelandic manuscripts, represent the most complete sources for Norse mythological narratives, but they also demonstrate how such narratives were being adapted and interpreted within Christian cultural contexts that both preserved and transformed their essential meanings. Snorri Sturluson's prose, Edda in particular, showed how mythological material could be treated as historical and poetic rather than religious truth while maintaining its psychological and artistic power. The Volsung Saga and related heroic narratives created literary forms that explored mythological themes through human rather than divine protagonists, making the essential insights about fate, honour, love, and death accessible to audiences who might not be comfortable with explicitly pagan religious content. These stories preserved the psychological sophistication of mythological thinking while adapting it to serve medieval literary and moral purposes. The influence of Norse mythology on later European literature, from the Nibelungenlied through Wagner's Ring Cycle to modern fantasy literature and popular culture, demonstrates the continuing relevance of mythological patterns and insights that transcend their original religious context to address universal human concerns about mortality, meaning, and the relationship between individual choice and cosmic necessity. The psychological insights embedded in Norse mythology, the understanding that wisdom comes through suffering, that strength and vulnerability are inextricably linked, that love and loss are inseparable, that meaning emerges from limitation rather than despite it, continue to resonate with contemporary audiences seeking frameworks for understanding existence that acknowledge both its beauty and its tragic dimensions. The Norse mythological imagination created perhaps the most psychologically realistic approach to divinity ever developed, presenting gods who are neither perfect nor immortal, but rather highly developed versions of human consciousness, facing the same ultimate limitations and existential challenges that characterize mortal existence. Their struggles with knowledge and ignorance, power and vulnerability, love and loss provided templates for understanding how consciousness could maintain dignity and purpose, even while acknowledging its own mortality and limitation. The artistic achievements inspired by Norse mythological themes, from medieval metalwork and stone carving to contemporary literature and film, demonstrate how these ancient narratives continue to generate creative expression that speaks to universal human experiences of conflict, loss, hope, and the search for meaning within conditions that often seem to make such meaning impossible or futile. The philosophical dimensions of Norse mythology, particularly its treatment of fate, free will, and the relationship between individual choice and cosmic necessity, contributed to European intellectual development in ways that complemented and sometimes challenged the more optimistic assumptions derived from classical and Christian sources. The Norse understanding that consciousness could achieve greatness precisely through acknowledging rather than denying its limitations provided alternative approaches to questions about heroism, wisdom, and value. As our journey through 2 millennia of Norse mythological consciousness draws toward its close, we find ourselves in the presence of perhaps the most unflinchingly honest mythological system ever created, one that looked directly into the face of mortality, limitation, and cosmic entropy, while still finding reason for courage, love, and creative action. These northern voices spoke truths that other mythological traditions often avoided or softened, creating frameworks for understanding existence that honoured both its beauty and its tragedy. The gods and heroes we have encountered throughout this exploration, from Odin seeking wisdom through suffering to Sigurd choosing glory despite knowing its price, from Brynhild transforming love into cosmic vengeance to the Einherjar preparing for battles they knew they could not win, represent not escapist fantasies but profound meditations on what it means to be conscious, mortal, and capable of choice in a universe that often seems indifferent to our hopes and fears. Their stories continue to speak across cultural and temporal boundaries because they addressed not the superficial concerns of particular historical circumstances, but the fundamental conditions that define conscious existence itself, the awareness of mortality that gives life meaning, the knowledge of limitation that makes choice significant, the experience of loss that makes love precious, and the recognition of futility that makes courage heroic. In the quiet hours when winter winds whisper through bare branches, and consciousness prepares for its nightly journey into the realm of dreams and renewal, these ancient Norse voices continue to offer their distinctive gifts of tragic wisdom and unflinching honesty about the human condition. Their recognition that beauty and doom were inseparable, that wisdom and sorrow went hand in hand, and that the highest forms of love and loyalty often led to the deepest forms of suffering provided frameworks for understanding existence that neither denied its difficulties nor succumbed to despair in the face of them. The Norse mythological achievement was to demonstrate that consciousness could maintain its dignity and purpose, even while fully acknowledging the limitations and losses that characterize temporal existence. Their gods and heroes found meaning not in transcending the human condition, but in embracing it so completely that their responses to universal challenges achieved cosmic significance. The great ash tree Yggdrasil still stands in the mythological imagination, its roots drawing from the wells of wisdom and fate, while its branches support the worlds, where consciousness continues its eternal adventure of discovering meaning within limitation, beauty within transience, and purpose within the knowledge of its own eventual ending. The Norse vision reminds us that such knowledge is not obstacle to meaning, but the very condition that makes meaning possible, not burden to be escaped, but gift to be received with the gratitude and courage that consciousness at its best can muster. As the aurora fades and the northern lights return to their celestial rest, the wisdom of the Norse remains eternally available to anyone willing to face existence with the unflinching honesty that characterized their greatest heroes and wisest gods. The understanding that life's value emerges not from its permanence, but from its preciousness, not from its security, but from its adventure, not from its guarantees, but from the courage with which consciousness meets whatever destiny awaits in the mystery that is existence itself. Beyond the familiar realms of Asgard and Midgard lie 7 other worlds that complete the cosmic architecture suspended within and around the great tree Yggdrasil. Each of these realms represents not merely a geographical location, but a state of consciousness, a mode of being, a different approach to the fundamental questions that existence poses to all sentient creatures. Alfheim, the realm of the Light Elves, shimmers with an ethereal beauty that suggests consciousness freed from the heavier constraints of physical form, while still maintaining individual identity and purpose. The Light Elves who dwell there represent the possibility of awareness that has transcended ordinary limitations without losing its essential character, beings who have achieved a form of existence that approaches the divine while remaining distinct from it. Their luminous nature and association with fertility and growth suggest forms of consciousness that enhance rather than diminish life, that bring increase and abundance rather than consumption and depletion. Unlike the gods who struggled constantly against entropy and approaching doom, the Light Elves embodied sustainable forms of existence that worked with rather than against the fundamental patterns of cosmic order. The psychological appeal of Alfheim lay in its representation of consciousness that had found harmony between individual identity and universal principles, between personal desires and cosmic necessity. The Light Elves served as an ideal toward which both gods and humans could aspire, demonstrating that transcendence was possible without the tragic dimensions that characterized divine existence in Asgard. Svartalfheim, the realm of the Dark Elves or Dwarves, existed deep beneath the earth where master craftsmen forged the magical objects that gods and heroes required for their cosmic roles. These subterranean artisans represented consciousness that had turned inward to develop skills and knowledge unavailable to beings who remained focused on external activities and achievements. The dwarves who created Mjolnir, Gungnir, Draupnir, and countless other magical artifacts possessed understanding of natural forces and material properties that enabled them to produce objects that transcended ordinary physical limitations. Their workshops beneath the Earth's surface suggested forms of wisdom that emerged from depth and hiddenness rather than height and visibility. The psychological significance of the Dwarven realm reflected Norse understanding of how the most valuable forms of knowledge often came from sources that seemed humble or marginal. The greatest weapons and tools were created not by gods or heroes, but by beings who remained largely invisible to the larger cosmic drama, while providing the essential resources that enabled that drama to unfold. Their occasional conflicts with gods and humans over payment for their services demonstrated how creative consciousness required recognition and appropriate compensation, how the production of beauty and utility generated its own forms of value and demand that could not be satisfied through force or deception, without destroying the very capabilities that made such production possible. Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, represented the chaotic forces that constantly threatened to overwhelm the ordered world of gods and humans, while also providing the creative tensions and challenges that made growth and development possible. The giants were not simply enemies to be defeated, but necessary adversaries whose opposition enabled consciousness to discover and develop its own potential. The complex relationships between gods and giants, including marriages, alliances, competitions, and hostilities, reflected the psychological truth that order and chaos were not absolute opposites, but complementary principles that required each other for their own completion. Many gods had giant ancestry, while some giants possessed wisdom and knowledge that surpassed divine understanding. The giants' association with wild nature, untamed landscapes, and primordial forces suggested forms of consciousness that remained closer to original creative energies but less capable of sustained organization and purposeful action. Their immense size and strength represented raw potential that could be either destructive or generative depending on how it was channeled and directed. The prophesied alliance between giants and Loki during Ragnarok demonstrated how suppressed or marginalized aspects of existence would eventually assert themselves with overwhelming power when the systems designed to contain them finally broke down. The giants' role in cosmic destruction was not malicious but natural, the return of chaos that had been temporarily held in check by divine order. Vanaheim, the mysterious realm of the Vanir gods, remained largely hidden throughout the surviving mythological sources, suggesting forms of divine consciousness that operated through different principles than the more familiar Aesir deities. The Vanir gods' association with fertility, prosperity, wisdom, and the ability to see into the future indicated divine approaches to existence that emphasized harmony and abundance rather than conflict and scarcity. The war between the Aesir and Vanir that ended with the exchange of hostages and the integration of Vanir wisdom into Asgard suggested psychological processes of conflict resolution that created synthesis rather than simple victory or defeat. The Vanir gods who joined the Aesir, particularly Njordr, Freyr and Freya, brought forms of knowledge and power that complemented rather than duplicated existing divine capabilities. Freya's mastery of Seder magic, her association with love and fertility, and her right to choose half of the slain warriors for her own hall, Sessrumnir represented divine feminine power that operated through different principles than the more martial and hierarchical structures typical of Asgard. Her tears of gold when separated from her mysterious husband Odr suggested forms of love and loss that transcended ordinary emotional categories. Freya's sacrifice of his magical sword to win the love of the giant maiden Gerda demonstrated how even divine consciousness could be transformed by genuine passion in ways that left it more vulnerable, but also more truly alive. His prophesied death at Ragnarok due to his lack of his sword represented the principle that authentic love required surrendering the very defences that enabled survival. Muspelheim, the realm of fire ruled by the giant Surtur, represented the ultimate destructive and creative force that would eventually consume the current cosmic order while enabling the birth of a new world from its ashes. This realm existed at the opposite extreme from the ice of Niflheim, and the interaction between these primordial forces had originally generated the cosmos and would eventually destroy and renew it. The psychological significance of Muspelheim extended beyond simple destruction to embody the principle of transformation through fire that burned away everything non-essential while preserving what possessed permanent value. Surtur's flaming sword that would set the world ablaze during Ragnarok represented not mere annihilation but purification and renewal. The flames of Muspelheim suggested forms of consciousness capable of complete transformation, of burning through all accumulated limitations and attachments to achieve new forms of existence. This fire was both terrible and necessary, destructive and liberating, an ending that was also a beginning. Niflheim, the primordial realm of ice and mist from which existence originally emerged, represented the fundamental mystery of being itself, the cold, formless potential from which all forms arose, and to which they would eventually return. This realm existed before creation, and would survive its destruction, embodying the principle of eternal possibility that transcended any particular manifestation. The Welvergelmeer that bubbled up from Niflheim's depths was the source of all rivers and the origin of life itself, suggesting that consciousness emerged from depths that remained forever hidden and unknowable. The dragon Nidhögr that gnawed constantly at Yggdrasil's roots while dwelling in Niflheim represented the principle of entropy that worked constantly to return all organized forms to their original undifferentiated state. Helheim, the realm of the dead ruled by Hel, the half-living daughter of Loki, represented the psychological space where consciousness continued after physical death but in forms that were neither punishment nor reward but simply different conditions of existence. This underworld was not a place of judgment but of continuation, where the dead maintained their essential identities while adapting to new limitations and possibilities. Hel herself, beautiful on one side and corpse-like on the other, embodied the principle that death was not opposite to life but its necessary complement. that endings and beginnings were inseparable aspects of the same fundamental process. Her fair treatment of the dead, regardless of their moral status during life, suggested forms of justice that transcended simple reward and punishment to embrace the full complexity of conscious existence. The great hall Eljudnir, where Hel received the dead, created a space for continued community and relationship that was neither idealized nor demonized, but simply different from mortal existence. The dead who dwelt there were not transformed into different kinds of beings, but remained themselves, while adapting to new conditions that required different forms of wisdom and adaptation. The practice of cedar magic, associated primarily with Freya and other feminine deities, but also learned and practiced by Odin himself, represented forms of consciousness and power that operated through different principles than the more familiar martial and rational approaches typically associated with masculine divine authority. Cider practitioners could see into the future, influence the course of events through ritual and incantation, and travel between worlds in spirit form while their bodies remained in trance. The psychological complexity of Cider lay in its recognition that consciousness possessed capabilities that transcended ordinary sensory experience and logical analysis, that awareness could extend beyond immediate physical circumstances to perceive patterns and possibilities hidden from normal perception. This magical system suggested that reality was more fluid and responsive to conscious intention than everyday experience typically revealed. The stigma sometimes associated with Cedar practice, particularly when performed by males, reflected cultural tensions about gender roles and the different forms of power available to masculine and feminine consciousness. Odin's willingness to learn Cedar despite social disapproval demonstrated his complete dedication to acquiring wisdom, regardless of conventional limitations or expectations. The trance states required for effective Cedar practice suggested forms of consciousness that could transcend ordinary ego boundaries while maintaining sufficient coherence to navigate otherworldly realms and return with useful knowledge. These altered states of awareness represented natural human capabilities that could be developed through appropriate training and practice. The Valur, wise women who served as priestesses and Cedar practitioners in Norse communities, embodied the integration of magical knowledge with practical wisdom about human nature and social needs. Their ability to provide guidance about future events, to heal through supernatural means, and to maintain connections with divine powers made them essential figures in communities that understood consciousness as extending far beyond individual human limitations. The Norse concept of posthumous reputation as a form of immortality reflected sophisticated understanding of how individual consciousness could transcend physical death through its effects on others and its integration into larger cultural narratives. The fame that survived heroic deeds provided a form of continued existence that was neither supernatural nor merely metaphorical, but represented genuine extension of individual identity beyond biological limitations. This emphasis on reputation and remembrance created psychological frameworks that encouraged present moment excellence and courage by connecting immediate choices with long-term consequences that extended far beyond individual lifespans. The knowledge that one's actions would be remembered and evaluated by future generations gave cosmic significance to decisions that might otherwise seem merely personal or temporary. The skaldic poetry tradition that preserved and transmitted heroic narratives served not merely as entertainment, but as technology for maintaining the presence of the dead within living communities. The complex poetic forms and elaborate kennings required for effective skaldic composition demonstrated that preserving heroic memory was itself a form of heroic action that demanded exceptional skill and dedication. The psychological appeal of this approach to immortality lay partly in its accessibility to anyone capable of extraordinary action, regardless of their relationship with gods or supernatural powers. While divine favour might enhance heroic capabilities, the essential requirement was the willingness to risk everything for achievements worthy of permanent remembrance. The integration of individual fame with collective memory created social systems that encouraged excellence, while also preserving cultural values and historical consciousness across generations. The stories that survived were not arbitrary collections of exciting events, but carefully selected narratives that embodied and transmitted essential insights about courage, loyalty, wisdom, and the proper response to limitation and loss. The Norse mythological calendar integrated divine narratives with natural cycles, in ways that made cosmic principles immediately present in everyday experience. The death and rebirth of Balder that paralleled the annual cycle of winter darkness and summer light created frameworks for understanding how endings and beginnings were inseparable aspects of the same fundamental process. The wild hunt led by Odin during the long winter nights represented divine activity that continued even when ordinary life seemed dormant or suspended, suggesting that consciousness remained active and purposeful even during periods that appeared unproductive or static. The ghostly procession of gods and spirits through the winter darkness provided psychological comfort during the most challenging season, while also acknowledging the reality of death and loss. The seasonal festivals that marked key transitions in the agricultural year created opportunities for communities to align their activities with larger cosmic patterns and to renew their relationships with divine powers through appropriate offerings and celebrations. These observances were not arbitrary social customs, but essential technologies for maintaining harmony between human consciousness and natural forces. The Yuletide celebrations that extended from winter solstice through the darkest weeks of the year created sacred time when the boundaries between worlds became permeable and the dead could visit the living while gods walked among mortals. This liminal period required special precautions and special hospitality, creating social customs that acknowledged both the dangers and the opportunities that accompanied cosmic transitions. The spring festivals that celebrated the return of fertility and growth provided opportunities for communities to participate in cosmic renewal through ritual activities that connected human fertility with agricultural abundance and divine creativity. These celebrations integrated sexuality, spirituality, and practical activities in ways that honoured all aspects of existence as sacred and necessary. The relationship between Odin and his ravens Hugin and Munin represented more than simple information gathering, but embodied profound insights about the nature of consciousness itself and its capacity to extend beyond immediate sensory experience through thought and memory. These supernatural birds served as externalized aspects of divine awareness that could perceive patterns and connections invisible to ordinary observation. The daily flight of the ravens throughout the 9 worlds created a rhythm of expansion and return that paralleled the natural processes of consciousness as it moved between focused attention and broader awareness, between immediate concern and cosmic perspective. Their evening reports to Odin demonstrated how individual awareness could be enhanced through systematic attention to information that might otherwise remain fragmented or ignored. The fear that the ravens might one day fail to return reflected psychological awareness of how consciousness depended on memory and thought for its continuity and coherence, how the loss of these faculties would represent a form of death more complete than physical dissolution. Odin's anxiety about cognitive diminishment revealed even divine consciousness as vulnerable to forms of entropy that threatened identity itself. The ravens' names, thought and memory, suggested that consciousness required both active reflection and passive retention to function effectively, that wisdom emerged from the dynamic interaction between present thinking and accumulated experience. Their partnership embodied the psychological truth that neither immediate perception nor stored knowledge alone could provide adequate understanding of complex situations. The widespread Norse association of ravens with battlefields and death demonstrated cultural recognition of how these intelligent birds served as intermediaries between life and death, witnesses to the transitions that marked the boundaries of mortal existence. Their presence at moments of ultimate significance suggested that consciousness itself was both observer and participant in the cosmic processes that determined fate and meaning. The Hof, or temple buildings, that served as centres for Norse religious activity, represented architectural attempts to create earthly spaces that reflected cosmic order, while also accommodating human needs for community worship and divine connection. These structures were not merely containers for ritual activity, but sacred technologies designed to facilitate communication between human and divine consciousness. The high-seat pillars that supported the roof beams in both temples and great halls were often carved with images of gods and heroes, creating vertical connections between earthly foundations and celestial realms that paralleled the cosmic axis represented by Yggdrasil. These architectural elements served both practical and symbolic functions, supporting physical structures while also maintaining spiritual connections. The placement of temples within landscapes that possessed natural sacred significance near springs, groves, mountains, or other features that suggested divine presence, demonstrated understanding of how built environments could enhance, rather than replace natural sacredness. The most effective sacred spaces were those that integrated human construction with existing spiritual geography. The ritual deposits found in the vicinity of temple sites, weapons, jewelry, tools, and other valuable objects deliberately sacrificed to divine powers, provide archaeological evidence for economic systems that recognize divine authority over human prosperity and security. These offerings represented community investment in maintaining positive relationships with supernatural forces. The seasonal festivals that brought together communities from wide geographical areas for celebration and worship created temporary sacred cities that demonstrated social capabilities for cooperation and organization on scales that transcended everyday practical necessities. These gatherings served educational, economic, and political functions, while also fulfilling essential religious obligations. The berserkers, warriors who fought in trance states that made them temporarily invulnerable to fear and pain, while also enhancing their strength and combat effectiveness, represented extreme forms of consciousness transformation that could be achieved through dedicated spiritual practice combined with physical training and psychological preparation. The animal spirits, bears, wolves, boars, that possessed berserkers during battle were not merely metaphorical, but represented actual alterations of consciousness that enabled access to non-human forms of awareness and capability. These transformations demonstrated that individual identity was more fluid and expandable than ordinary experience suggested. The social integration of berserkers within Norse communities reflected cultural recognition that such extreme forms of consciousness served essential functions during crises that required capabilities beyond normal human limits. Their special status and responsibilities acknowledge both the value and the dangers associated with consciousness that had transcended ordinary limitations. The ritual preparations required for berserker transformation, fasting, meditation, ceremonial clothing, group activities that enhanced collective trance states, created technologies for consciousness alteration that could be learned and transmitted while also requiring exceptional personal dedication and natural aptitude. The psychological costs of berserker practice, including difficulty returning to normal consciousness and social relationships after battle, demonstrated that transcendence of ordinary limitations came with prices that affected not only individual warriors, but their families and communities. These costs were accepted because the benefits during times of crisis were considered essential for collective survival. The 24 runes of the Elder Futhark represented not merely a writing system but a complete technology for encoding and transmitting wisdom that operated simultaneously on practical, magical, and spiritual levels. Each rune embodied both a sound, a concept, and a form of power that could be activated through proper knowledge and application. The mythological narrative of Odin's discovery of the runes through self-sacrifice on Yggdrasil suggested that this knowledge came not through rational analysis or cultural development, but through direct mystical experience that required the complete surrender of ordinary consciousness. The 9 days and nights of hanging, pierced by his own spear, represented initiation through symbolic death and rebirth. The runic poems preserved in later sources provided systematic interpretations of each rune's meaning and significance, creating educational resources that enabled the transmission of runic wisdom while also preserving the essential mystery that made such wisdom powerful rather than merely informational. These poems balanced revelation and concealment in ways that protected sacred knowledge from misuse while making it available to serious students. The practical applications of runic knowledge range from simple identification and communication to complex magical operations that could influence weather, heal diseases, provide protection in battle, and facilitate communication with supernatural powers. The effectiveness of runic magic depended not only on correct technique, but on the practitioner's understanding of the cosmic principles that gave runes their power. The integration of runic inscriptions into everyday objects, weapons, jewelry, tools, buildings, demonstrated how spiritual wisdom could be incorporated into practical activities to enhance their effectiveness, while also maintaining constant connection with divine sources of knowledge and power. As we approach the completion of our journey through the Norse mythological imagination, we find ourselves not with final answers but with deepened appreciation for questions that transcend simple resolution. The Norse vision of existence as perpetual movement between creation and destruction Order and chaos, wisdom and ignorance, created frameworks for understanding that embraced paradox and contradiction as essential features of reality rather than problems to be solved. The gods who knew their own doom but continued their cosmic responsibilities, the heroes who chose glory despite its inevitable tragic consequences, the wise women who possessed knowledge they could not use to prevent suffering, all embodied forms of consciousness that had learned to find meaning within limitation rather than despite it, to discover purpose within uncertainty rather than through false certainty. The mythological narrative that began with the emergence of cosmos from primordial ice and fire and ended with the destruction and renewal of Ragnarok created cyclical rather than linear understanding of time and change. This cosmic breathing, expansion and contraction, manifestation and dissolution, suggested that consciousness itself participated in eternal processes that transcended individual existence, while also depending on individual participation for their fulfillment. The preservation of Norse mythological wisdom through centuries of cultural transformation and religious change demonstrates its relevance to universal, rather than merely historical concerns. The psychological insights embedded in these ancient narratives continue to illuminate contemporary struggles with meaning, mortality, and the relationship between individual choice and cosmic necessity. In the deepest hours of contemplation, when consciousness turns inward to examine its own nature and destiny, the Norse voices continue to offer their distinctive gifts of tragic wisdom and unflinching honesty. Their recognition that existence was simultaneously beautiful and terrible, meaningful and absurd, precious and transient provides frameworks for understanding that neither deny life's difficulties nor succumb to despair in the face of them. The great tree Yggdrasil continues to support the worlds of imagination where these eternal stories unfold, its roots drawing sustenance from wells of memory and possibility, while its branches shelter all the forms of consciousness that seek meaning within the eternal dance of creation and destruction that defines existence itself. In this sacred space between sleeping and waking, between memory and anticipation, the wisdom of the North remains forever available to any consciousness willing to receive it with the courage and openness that such wisdom both requires and rewards. The aurora borealis continues its celestial dance across northern skies, reminding all who witness its beauty that the most profound truths often emerge at the boundaries between different states of being, in the liminal spaces where ordinary consciousness touches the mystery that surrounds and sustains all existence. The Norse legacy lives on in this eternal twilight between day and night, between knowing and unknowing, between the human and the divine, forever inviting consciousness to discover its own deepest possibilities within the magnificent and terrible adventure that is existence itself. The Norse understanding of human consciousness as composed of multiple spiritual components created psychological frameworks far more complex and nuanced than simple dualistic concepts of body and soul. The medieval Icelandic sources preserve evidence for belief systems that recognized at least 4 distinct aspects of individual identity, each with its own characteristics, functions, and post-mortem destiny. The likami, or physical body, served as the visible foundation for consciousness during mortal life, but was understood as only one component of a larger spiritual architecture that extended beyond immediate sensory experience into realms invisible to ordinary perception. This material form provided the stable platform from which other aspects of identity could develop and function, but was never considered the complete definition of individual existence. The hugr, often translated as mind or thought, represented the active, rational aspect of consciousness capable of leaving the body during sleep or trance to travel independently and gather information unavailable through normal sensory channels. The hugr could appear to others in dreams or visions, could influence events at a distance, and possessed a form of independent existence that survived physical death in ways that maintained personal identity and memory. The psychological sophistication of this concept lay in its recognition that consciousness possessed capabilities that transcended immediate physical circumstances, that individual awareness could extend beyond the boundaries of the material body to perceive and influence reality through non-ordinary means. The hugr represented the travelling aspect of consciousness that enabled dreams, out-of-body experiences and various forms of psychic perception. The hammer, or shape, or form, constituted the spiritual double of the physical body that could be perceived by individuals with appropriate sensitivity or training. This subtle body could change its appearance, could manifest in animal form during states of spiritual transformation, and served as the vehicle for consciousness during certain types of magical practice and supernatural experience. The hammer's ability to take different shapes reflected Norse understanding of identity as more fluid and transformable than ordinary experience suggested, recognition that consciousness could transcend the apparent limitations of fixed physical form to access different modes of being and perception. The shape-shifting capabilities associated with the hammer were not merely supernatural fantasy, but represented actual spiritual technologies that could be developed through appropriate practice. The Fylgja, perhaps the most mysterious of the spiritual components, served as a protective spirit or guardian that accompanied individuals throughout their lives while also connecting them to their family lineage and ancestral wisdom. The Fylgja often appeared in animal form and could be perceived by others as an indication of an individual's spiritual power, psychological state, and future destiny. The relationship between person and Fylgja was not simple ownership but complex partnership that required mutual respect and understanding for optimal functioning. Individuals who maintained positive relationships with their Fylgja enjoyed enhanced intuition, protection from spiritual dangers, and access to wisdom that transcended personal experience. Those who neglected or abused this relationship found themselves spiritually vulnerable and cut off from sources of guidance that could mean the difference between success and disaster. The Hamingja, often translated as luck, but representing something far more substantial, constituted the spiritual force or essence that determined individual destiny and effectiveness in achieving desired outcomes. This spiritual component could be enhanced through proper conduct, appropriate ritual observance, and maintaining positive relationships with supernatural powers, but could also be diminished or lost through misconduct, spiritual neglect, or violation of sacred obligations. The psychology of Hamingja reflected Norse understanding of how individual actions influenced not only immediate circumstances but also deeper spiritual conditions that affected long-term patterns of fortune and misfortune. The concept suggested that luck was not random occurrence, but spiritual condition that could be cultivated and transmitted across generations through conscious effort and ethical behavior. The inheritance of Hamingja from ancestors to descendants created spiritual lineages that connected individual identity with collective family destiny in ways that made personal choices significant for future generations. This understanding of spiritual inheritance provided psychological frameworks that encouraged excellence and ethical behavior by connecting present actions with long-term consequences that extended far beyond individual lifespans. The relationship between Norse warriors and their weapons transcended simple tool use to create spiritual partnerships that embodied principles of mutual loyalty, shared destiny, and reciprocal obligation. Weapons possessed their own spiritual essence, their own history and reputation, and their own capacity for forming relationships with worthy wielders who could unlock their full potential. The naming of weapons, swords like Gram and Turfing, axes and spears with their own individual identities, reflected understanding that effective weapons were not merely manufactured objects, but spiritual entities that required appropriate recognition and respect for optimal performance. These names were not arbitrary designations, but acknowledgements of spiritual reality that could influence material effectiveness. The forging of exceptional weapons required not only technical skill, but spiritual preparation and divine assistance that connected the craftsman with supernatural sources of knowledge and power. The legendary weapons created by dwarven smiths possessed magical properties precisely because their makers understood metallurgy as spiritual practice rather than merely mechanical technique. The inheritance of weapons from father to son, from mentor to student, from hero to worthy successor, created lineages of spiritual power that connected generations through shared participation in warrior traditions that transcended individual mortality. These weapons carried the spiritual essence of their previous owners, accumulating power and reputation through their participation in significant events and relationships. The psychological bond between warrior and weapon created forms of extended identity that enhanced combat effectiveness, while also creating vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through spiritual as well as physical means. Warriors who lost their primary weapons often experienced profound identity crises that that affected their confidence and effectiveness until appropriate replacement relationships could be established. The ritual care of weapons, cleaning, sharpening, oiling, appropriate storage, represented spiritual practices that maintained the partnership between warrior and weapon, while also demonstrating respect for the spiritual forces that enabled effective combat. Neglect of these obligations could result in weapon failure at crucial moments, when reliability was essential for survival. The eventual fate of legendary weapons, burial with their owners, ritual sacrifice in water or fire, careful preservation for future heroes, reflected understanding that spiritual entities required appropriate treatment after the death of their primary partners. The destruction or loss of famous weapons was often considered as significant as the death of the heroes who wielded them. The Norse concept of divine kingship created complex relationships between human rulers and supernatural powers that required constant negotiation and mutual obligation rather than simple hierarchical authority. Kings served as intermediaries between their people and the gods, responsible for maintaining the spiritual conditions that enabled community prosperity and protection from hostile forces. The ritual installation of kings through ceremonies that connected them with divine authority created spiritual transformations that enhanced their capabilities, while also imposing obligations that limited their personal freedom in service of collective needs. The sacred nature of royal authority meant that kings could not rule through simple coercion, but needed to demonstrate worthiness through actions that maintained divine favour and public confidence. The concept of the king's luck, or royal hamingja, suggested that rulers possessed enhanced spiritual force that could influence weather patterns, agricultural fertility, military success, and other conditions essential for community welfare. This understanding made the personal conduct and spiritual condition of kings matters of public concern that affected everyone within their realm of authority. The seasonal responsibilities of sacred kingship included performing rituals that aligned human activities with cosmic cycles, making offerings that maintained positive relationships with divine powers, and serving as the focal point for community celebrations that renewed collective identity and purpose. These ceremonial functions were not merely symbolic but practical technologies for maintaining social cohesion and spiritual protection. The tragic dimension of Norse kingship lay in the recognition that royal authority was temporary, and that even the most successful rulers would eventually face defeat, death, or divine disfavour that ended their reign. This awareness of mortality and limitation made royal choices more rather than less significant, since they could not be justified by appeals to permanent authority or eternal mandate. The relationship between kings and their warbands created bonds of mutual loyalty and obligation that transcended simple employment or political alliance to become forms of spiritual kinship that connected individual destinies with collective purposes. The breakdown of these relationships through betrayal, cowardice, or neglect of obligation created forms of spiritual pollution that affected entire communities. The Norse relationship with landscape transcended simple utilitarian concerns to create spiritual geography, where natural features served as repositories of cultural memory, markers of significant events, and dwelling places of supernatural powers that required appropriate recognition and respect from human communities. Sacred groves, where trees were considered dwelling places of gods or spirits, created natural temples that required no human construction but demanded careful maintenance and protection from desecration. These woodland sanctuaries provided spaces for ritual activity, meditation, and communication with divine powers through means that emphasized harmony between human consciousness and natural forces. Springs and wells that served as sources of wisdom, healing, or prophetic inspiration created focal points for pilgrimage and ritual observance that connected local communities with cosmic sources of knowledge and power. The offerings deposited in these sacred waters, weapons, jewellery, food, valuable objects, represented economic investment in maintaining positive relationships with supernatural forces. Burial mounds and stone circles that marked the graves of ancestors or commemorated significant events created lasting monuments that preserved cultural memory, while also serving as dwelling places for spirits of the dead who could provide guidance, protection, and connection with traditional wisdom. These artificial landscape features integrated human construction with natural geography in ways that enhanced, rather than diminished, spiritual significance. The naming of landscape features after gods, heroes, or significant events created systems of environmental memory that preserved historical consciousness while also maintaining awareness of supernatural presence within everyday geographical experience. Hills, rivers, rocks, and other natural formations served as permanent reminders of mythological narratives and cultural values. The seasonal use of particular locations for festivals, assemblies, markets, and other community gatherings created rhythms of human activity that honoured both natural cycles and cultural traditions in ways that reinforced collective identity while maintaining connection with sacred principles. These temporary transformations of ordinary space into sacred space demonstrated how consciousness could enhance natural significance through appropriate ritual attention. The Norse understanding of poetry as spiritual technology rather than mere entertainment created complex systems of verbal artistry that operated simultaneously on aesthetic, magical, and educational levels. Skaldic and Eddic poetry served as repositories of cultural wisdom, as technologies for consciousness alteration, and as practical tools for influencing material circumstances through supernatural means. The intricate verbal patterns of skaldic poetry, with their elaborate kennings, complex alliterative structures, and multiple layers of meaning, created aesthetic experiences that altered consciousness in ways that enabled access to non-ordinary states of awareness and understanding. The composition and performance of such poetry required forms of mental discipline and spiritual preparation that transcended ordinary linguistic competence. The memorization and transmission of traditional poems preserved cultural knowledge across generations while also training memory capabilities that enhanced individual psychological development and community intellectual resources. The oral preservation of extensive poetic traditions demonstrated cognitive achievements that modern literate cultures often underestimate or ignore. The use of poetry in magical practices, Gulda, the singing or chanting of spells that influenced weather, healed diseases, provided protection, or affected the thoughts and emotions of others, created practical applications for verbal artistry that connected aesthetic achievement with material effectiveness. The power of such magical poetry depended not only on correct technique, but on the practitioner's understanding of cosmic principles and spiritual relationships. The integration of mythological narratives within poetic forms created educational technologies that transmitted essential cultural knowledge while also providing frameworks for individual psychological development and spiritual understanding. The stories preserved in Eddic poetry served simultaneously as entertainment, education, and spiritual guidance for communities that understood consciousness as extending far beyond immediate practical concerns. The social status of skilled poets, their roles as advisors to kings and preservers of cultural memory, their function as mediators between human communities and divine powers, demonstrated recognition that linguistic artistry served essential community functions that transcended mere aesthetic pleasure to encompass spiritual, educational, and political dimensions of collective life. The Norse exploration of the relationship between wisdom and suffering created psychological frameworks that acknowledged the terrible price often required for genuine understanding while also affirming the value of knowledge that came through direct experience of limitation and loss. This approach to wisdom differed fundamentally from traditions that promised enlightenment through the elimination of suffering or the transcendence of mortal conditions. Odin's sacrifices to gain knowledge, his eye for a drink from Mimir's well, his self-hanging to discover runic secrets, his various transformations and deceptions to obtain magical mead or other sources of wisdom, demonstrated that even divine consciousness had to pay real prices for genuine understanding. These were not symbolic gestures, but actual losses that permanently altered his nature and capabilities. The psychology embedded in these mythological narratives suggested that superficial knowledge, the kind that could be obtained without significant cost or risk, lacked the transformative power that made wisdom valuable for addressing fundamental existential challenges. True understanding required willingness to surrender what one already possessed in exchange for what one needed to become. The transmission of hard-won wisdom from gods to humans created relationships of teacher and student that acknowledged both the value of divine knowledge and the necessity for human beings to make their own sacrifices and efforts to receive and integrate such knowledge effectively. Divine wisdom could not be simply bestowed but required preparation and worthiness that demonstrated genuine commitment. The tragic dimension of divine wisdom lay in its recognition that knowledge of future events, understanding of cosmic patterns, and insight into the nature of existence did not provide escape from limitation and suffering, but rather deepened appreciation for their necessity and meaning. Wisdom enhanced, rather than diminished awareness of tragic dimensions of existence. The practical application of divine wisdom in human circumstances required forms of translation and adaptation that acknowledged the differences between divine and mortal consciousness, while also recognizing their fundamental similarities and shared participation in cosmic processes that affected all forms of conscious existence. The Norse emphasis on hospitality as sacred obligation created social systems that recognized the spiritual significance of relationships between guests and hosts, strangers and community members, individuals with resources and those in need. These customs reflected understanding that material generosity served spiritual functions that transcended immediate practical benefits to encompass cosmic principles of reciprocity and balance. The ritual obligations surrounding the reception of guests, provision of food, shelter, protection, and entertainment without prior inquiry about identity or purpose, created opportunities for encounters with supernatural beings who tested human character and rewarded or punished behavior accordingly. The stories of gods or other divine beings traveling in disguise to evaluate human hospitality demonstrated that ordinary social interactions possessed cosmic significance. The gift exchange systems that created and maintained relationships between individuals, families, and communities operated according to principles that connected material transactions with spiritual bonds extending across generations and geographical distances. These exchanges were not simply economic activities, but technologies for creating and maintaining social networks that provided security, identity, and meaning. The psychology of gift-giving and receiving involved complex negotiations of status, obligation, and relationship that required sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and spiritual principles. Appropriate gifts demonstrated knowledge of the recipient's needs and circumstances while also expressing the giver's values and intentions. Inappropriate or inadequate gifts could damage relationships or create obligations that the giver could not fulfill. The legendary generosity of heroes and kings, their distribution of treasure, weapons, land, and other valuable resources to followers and guests, created models for behavior that connected individual excellence with collective welfare in ways that made personal achievement meaningful through its contribution to community prosperity and security. The curse that often followed violations of hospitality customs, the divine punishment that befell those who harmed guests or failed to provide appropriate welcome, reflected understanding that social obligations possessed spiritual enforcement mechanisms that operated independently of human law or authority to maintain cosmic justice and moral order. The Norse integration of sexuality, spirituality, and cosmic creativity created religious frameworks that understood human fertility as participation in divine processes of creation and renewal, rather than mere biological function or personal pleasure. These mysteries connected individual relationships with cosmic principles in ways that made intimate choices significant for community welfare and spiritual development. The sacred marriages between gods and giants, gods and humans, and other supernatural beings represented the principle that creative union required the integration of different and sometimes opposing forces to generate new forms of existence and consciousness. These mythological unions created precedents for human relationships that honored both passion and spiritual purpose. The fertility rituals associated with seasonal transitions, particularly spring celebrations that honored the return of creative force after winter dormancy, created opportunities for communities to participate in cosmic renewal through ritual activities that connected human sexuality with agricultural abundance and divine creativity. The psychological significance of fertility deities like Freya and Freya lay partly in their representation of divine consciousness that operated through pleasure, abundance, and creative joy rather than the more familiar modes of wisdom through suffering or power through conflict. These deities offered alternative approaches to spiritual development that emphasized harmony and increase rather than struggle and sacrifice. The integration of sexuality and spirituality in Norse religious practice reflected understanding that human beings were designed for pleasure as well as suffering, for abundance as well as limitation, for creative participation in cosmic processes rather than simple endurance of difficult circumstances. This integration created psychological frameworks that honoured all aspects of human nature as potentially sacred. The taboos and obligations surrounding sexual relationships, the codes of honour that governed interactions between men and women, the spiritual consequences of adultery, rape, or other violations of sexual ethics, demonstrated recognition that intimate relationships possessed power to create or destroy spiritual conditions that affected entire communities across generations. The Norse understanding of consciousness as capable of travelling between different realms of existence created spiritual technologies that enabled systematic exploration of non-ordinary reality through various forms of trance, meditation, ritual practice, and consciousness alteration. These journeys were not escapist fantasies but practical methods for obtaining knowledge and power unavailable through ordinary sensory experience. The shamanic aspects of Norse spiritual practice, particularly those associated with Seder magic and the activities of Velur, wise women, created systematic approaches to consciousness alteration that required extensive training, natural aptitude, and community support for safe and effective implementation. These practices represented sophisticated psychological technologies that could be taught and learned. The use of various substances, alcohol, mushrooms, herbs, and other plant medicines to facilitate altered states of consciousness created pharmacological support for spiritual practices that required temporary dissolution of ordinary ego boundaries to access expanded forms of awareness and perception. These substances were understood as allies rather than mere intoxicants, spiritual tools that required respect and appropriate preparation. The ritual context that surrounded consciousness alteration, ceremonial clothing, sacred locations, group activities that enhanced individual trance states, protective measures that ensured safe return to ordinary awareness, demonstrated understanding that such practices required community support and spiritual protection to prevent psychological damage or spiritual possession by hostile forces. The information and experiences obtained through consciousness alteration, prophecies about future events, healing knowledge, communication with spirits of the dead, insight into hidden patterns and connections, served practical functions that benefited entire communities, while also providing spiritual development opportunities for individuals willing to undertake the risks and obligations associated with such practices. The integration of visionary experiences with practical decision-making, the use of prophetic knowledge to guide strategic choices, healing revelations to treat diseases, communication with supernatural advisors to solve complex problems, created feedback systems that validated or corrected consciousness alteration practices through their effectiveness in addressing real-world challenges. The Norse understanding of skilled craftsmanship as spiritual practice, rather than mere technical competence, created frameworks that connected artistic achievement with divine inspiration, while also acknowledging the necessity for extensive training, natural talent and community support for the development of exceptional capabilities in any field of endeavour. The legendary smiths whose weapons and tools possessed magical properties achieved their extraordinary results through combination of technical mastery, spiritual preparation, and divine assistance that transformed ordinary materials into objects capable of transcending normal physical limitations. Their workshops served as temples where spiritual and material forces converged to create results impossible through purely mechanical means. The skaldic poets whose verses possessed power to influence events, preserve memory and alter consciousness developed their abilities through rigorous training in traditional forms, combined with individual creativity that pushed linguistic artistry into new territories of expression and effectiveness. Their poetry served functions that transcended entertainment to encompass education, magic, and spiritual guidance. The master shipbuilders whose vessels could navigate between worlds, survive supernatural storms, and serve as vehicles for consciousness journey to otherworldly realms created transportation technologies that operated according to spiritual as well as physical principles. Their understanding of materials, design, and construction integrated practical knowledge with mystical insight. The textile workers whose tapestries and clothing possessed protective properties enhanced the spiritual power of their wearers and served as repositories of cultural knowledge demonstrated how domestic crafts could achieve levels of spiritual significance that transcended ordinary utility to serve essential community functions related to identity, memory, and magical practice. The recognition that exceptional craftspeople often possess supernatural assistance or inspiration, their relationships with divine patrons, their access to secret knowledge, their ability to achieve results that seem to transcend natural limitations, created social frameworks that honoured artistic achievement while also acknowledging its spiritual dimensions and obligations. As we draw toward the completion of our extended journey through the Norse mythological consciousness, we find ourselves contemplating the fundamental rhythm that underlies all existence, the eternal alternation between manifestation and dissolution, building and destroying, learning and forgetting, that gives meaning to individual actions while also placing them within cosmic contexts that transcend personal understanding or control. The Norse recognition that all created things carry within themselves the seeds of their own destruction did not lead to despair or paralysis, but rather to enhanced appreciation for the preciousness of temporary manifestation and the significance of choices made within conditions of limitation and uncertainty. This wisdom transformed awareness of mortality from burden into gift, from obstacle into opportunity for heroic response to universal conditions. The cyclical nature of Norse cosmology, the recognition that Ragnarok would be followed by renewal, that destruction would enable new creation, that endings were also beginnings, created frameworks for understanding individual death, within contexts that honoured both the reality of loss and the continuity of larger patterns that transcended any particular manifestation, while also depending on such manifestations for their fulfillment. The integration of tragic and comic elements within Norse mythological narratives reflected sophisticated understanding of how consciousness navigates between joy and sorrow, hope and despair, meaning and absurdity, without requiring final resolution of these tensions, but rather learning to dance with them as permanent features of existence that give texture and depth to experience. The psychological maturity demonstrated by Norse approaches to fate, suffering, and limitation provided frameworks for adult responses to difficult circumstances that neither denied reality through false optimism nor succumbed to despair through exclusive focus on negative possibilities, but rather found ways to maintain dignity, purpose, and even joy within conditions that could not be fundamentally altered. The continuing relevance of Norse mythological insights for contemporary consciousness lies partly in their recognition that human beings are designed not for simple happiness or security, but for complex engagement with existence that includes both pleasure and pain, both achievement and loss, both connection and separation, as necessary components of complete rather than partial experience of what it means to be conscious, mortal, and capable of choice. In these final moments of our contemplative journey, as consciousness prepares to return from mythological realms to the immediate circumstances of contemporary existence, the Norse voices offer their parting gifts of acceptance and encouragement, the understanding that existence is both more terrible and more beautiful than ordinary awareness typically recognizes, and that the appropriate response to such recognition is neither retreat nor conquest, but graceful participation in the magnificent and mysterious dance that connects all forms of consciousness within the eternal play of creation and destruction that is existence itself. The great wheel turns, the seasons cycle, the gods prepare for their final battle, while also enabling new possibilities to emerge from the ashes of their destruction. In this eternal present moment that contains all possibilities, Norse wisdom continues to offer its distinctive contributions to human understanding: the courage to face truth without illusion, the strength to act with purpose despite uncertainty, and the grace to find meaning within limitation that transforms consciousness from victim to participant in the cosmic adventure that is life itself. In the Norse understanding of consciousness and identity, the boundary between human and animal awareness was not fixed barrier, but permeable membrane through which spiritual forces could flow in both directions. The relationship between humans and animals transcended simple dominion or utilitarian use to encompass complex forms of spiritual partnership, mutual recognition, and shared participation in cosmic processes that connected all forms of life within sacred webs of meaning and purpose. The wolf, feared and revered in equal measure, represented the principle of wild consciousness that operated beyond the constraints of social order and moral convention. Fenrir, the giant wolf whose growth alarmed the gods until they bound him with unbreakable chains, embodied the recognition that wild nature, once suppressed or betrayed, would eventually return with overwhelming destructive power that could not be controlled or contained. The psychological complexity of the wolf symbol reflected Norse understanding of how consciousness contained within itself both civilized and savage potentials, both the capacity for loyalty and cooperation that enabled community life, and the capacity for violence and destruction that could tear such communities apart. The wolf packs that hunted in coordinated groups demonstrated that wild consciousness was not merely chaotic, but possessed its own forms of intelligence and social organization. The ravens associated with Odin represented consciousness capable of moving freely between different realms of existence, while maintaining connection to wisdom and memory that transcended immediate sensory experience. These black-winged messengers served as intermediaries between visible and invisible worlds, bringing information that could not be obtained through ordinary observation or rational analysis. The bear, whose strength and solitary nature made it a symbol of individual power operating independently of social support or approval, represented consciousness that had achieved self-sufficiency through complete integration of aggressive and protective potentials. The berserkers who channeled bear consciousness during battle accessed forms of strength and fearlessness that transcended normal human limitations, while also risking loss of social identity and relationship. The horse, particularly Odin's eight-legged Sleipnir, represented consciousness capable of travelling between different states of being, different levels of reality, different temporal dimensions. These supernatural steeds could carry their riders across the boundaries that normally separated life from death, present from past and future, ordinary awareness from visionary experience. The serpent or dragon, symbol of primordial wisdom and destructive potential combined in single form, represented consciousness that possessed knowledge of cosmic principles, but remained indifferent to human moral categories and social concerns. Jörmungandr, the world serpent that encircled Midgard in the ocean depths, embodied the principle that destructive forces were not external threats, but fundamental aspects of existence itself. The boar, sacred to Freyr and associated with fertility and abundance, represented consciousness that operated through direct engagement with physical pleasure and material prosperity rather than the more ascetic approaches typically associated with spiritual development. The golden boar, Gullinbursti, that could travel through air and water faster than any horse demonstrated that spiritual consciousness could manifest through enhancement rather than transcendence of natural capabilities. The stag that fed upon Yggdrasil's branches while the dragon gnawed at its roots represented the principle of consumption and renewal that maintained cosmic balance through ongoing cycles of creation and destruction. These deer embodied consciousness that participated in cosmic maintenance through fulfilling their essential nature rather than through self-sacrifice or moral striving. The Norse understanding of time as multiple overlapping cycles rather than single linear progression created frameworks for consciousness that could navigate between different temporal dimensions while maintaining coherence and purpose within each level of temporal experience. This sophisticated approach to time consciousness enabled practical planning while also acknowledging the mythic and eternal dimensions that gave immediate choices cosmic significance. The concept of fate, or word, operated not as simple predetermination but as pattern recognition that enabled consciousness to perceive the probable consequences of particular actions and choices within larger webs of relationship and cause and effect that extended across generations and geographical boundaries. Understanding one's word meant learning to read the patterns that connected past actions with present circumstances and future possibilities. The seasonal cycles that structured Norse religious and social life created rhythms of expansion and contraction, activity and rest, that aligned human consciousness with natural forces while also providing frameworks for individual and community development across longer temporal spans. These cycles enabled consciousness to participate in cosmic renewal while maintaining personal identity and continuity. The genealogical consciousness that connected individual identity with ancestral lineages created temporal frameworks that extended personal significance across multiple generations, while also creating obligations and opportunities that transcended immediate practical concerns. Understanding one's place within family history provided context for decision-making that honoured both tradition and innovation. The prophetic consciousness that enabled some individuals to perceive future events operated through recognition of patterns that were already present but had not yet manifested their full implications in material circumstances. This form of temporal awareness required training in perception that could distinguish between probable and merely possible future developments. The mythic time that contained the stories of gods and heroes existed parallel to ordinary historical time, but could be accessed through ritual, meditation, and consciousness alteration, in ways that made ancient events immediately relevant to contemporary circumstances. This temporal dimension provided sources of wisdom and guidance that remained eternally available to any consciousness capable of appropriate receptivity. The moment of death that represented transition between temporal and eternal dimensions of existence created psychological frameworks for understanding mortality as transformation rather than simple ending, as movement between different states of consciousness rather than cessation of awareness itself. Death represented graduation from one level of cosmic education to another rather than failure or punishment. The Norse conception of feminine divine power operated through principles that complemented but also transcended the more familiar masculine approaches to wisdom, strength, and spiritual authority. The goddesses and other feminine supernatural beings possessed capabilities and knowledge that were essential for cosmic balance, while also representing alternative approaches to consciousness development that emphasized receptivity, transformation, and connection with life-giving forces. Frigg, the queen of the gods whose knowledge of fate exceeded even Odin's, but who never revealed what she knew, represented divine feminine wisdom that operated through silence and patience rather than active seeking and acquisition. Her ability to see the future combined with her choice not to speak of it demonstrated understanding that knowledge without appropriate timing and context could cause more harm than ignorance. The psychological sophistication of Frigg's character lay in her recognition that love sometimes required accepting powerlessness, that the deepest forms of care involved respecting the autonomy and destiny of others, even when such respect meant watching them make choices that led to suffering or destruction. Her silent knowledge represented maternal wisdom that understood the necessity for experience over protection. Freya, the goddess of love and fertility, whose practice of Seder magic made her the primary teacher of consciousness alteration techniques, represented divine feminine power that operated through transformation and ecstasy rather than control and domination. Her ability to travel between worlds, to influence the course of events through magical practice, and to choose half the slain warriors for her own hall, demonstrated forms of authority that complemented rather than competed with masculine divine power. The Valur or wise women who served as priestesses and prophets in Norse communities embodied the integration of feminine consciousness with spiritual authority and practical wisdom. Their ability to perceive hidden patterns, to communicate with supernatural beings, and to provide guidance about future events made them essential figures whose advice was sought by kings and commoners alike. The psychological appeal of these wise women lay partly in their representation of power that operated through knowledge and insight rather than physical force or political authority. Their influence depended on their ability to perceive and articulate truths that others could not see, making them both valuable and potentially dangerous to existing power structures. The Norns, who determined fate by weaving the threads of individual and collective destiny, represented divine feminine consciousness that operated through recognition and implementation of cosmic principles rather than arbitrary personal choice. Their systematic attention to the patterns that connected actions with consequences created the fundamental structure within which free will could operate meaningfully. The Disir, female protective spirits associated with particular families and locations, represented feminine spiritual power that operated through care and protection rather than conquest and achievement. These guardian spirits maintained the conditions that enabled life to flourish, while also defending against threats that could destroy the communities and individuals under their protection. Hel, the goddess who ruled the realm of the dead with justice and compassion that transcended simple moral categories, represented feminine divine authority that could embrace both life and death as necessary aspects of cosmic order. Her half-living, half-dead appearance symbolized the recognition that existence and non-existence were complementary rather than opposing principles. The Norse emphasis on honor as the fundamental organizing principle of individual and social life created complex psychological frameworks that connected personal identity with community recognition in ways that made reputation more valuable than life itself, while also creating systems of mutual obligation and accountability that maintained social order across generations. The concept of honour operated not as simple moral virtue, but as social recognition of excellence that had been demonstrated through actions requiring courage, skill, and commitment to values that transcended immediate self-interest. Honour could not be claimed or assumed, but had to be earned through choices that risked everything for principles that the community recognised as worthy of such risk. The relationship between honour and shame created psychological dynamics that encouraged excellence while also creating vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through attacks on reputation rather than direct physical confrontation. The loss of honour was considered worse than death because it represented spiritual rather than merely physical destruction. The mechanisms for gaining and maintaining honour, generous hospitality, loyalty to friends and family, courage in battle, wisdom in counsel, skill in craftsmanship or other valued activities, created social systems that encouraged individual development while also serving collective needs for security, prosperity, and cultural continuity. The collective nature of honour meant that individual reputation affected family members, followers, and community associates in ways that made personal choices significant for others who had not directly participated in the actions that created consequences. This understanding of shared responsibility created social pressure for excellence, while also providing mutual support for those who maintained community standards. The inheritance of honour across generations meant that children received both advantages and obligations from their ancestors' reputations, creating motivations for excellence that extended beyond immediate personal concerns to encompass family legacy and cultural transmission of values that had been tested through historical experience. The restoration of honour after loss or damage required not merely future excellence, but specific actions that addressed the particular nature of the dishonour, while also demonstrating commitment to values that transcended the circumstances that had created the original problem. This process of honour restoration provided opportunities for redemption that acknowledged human fallibility while maintaining social standards. The ultimate test of honour came through response to impossible situations where all available choices involved loss or compromise of some valued principle. The ability to choose the form of one's destruction, to maintain dignity and purpose even while facing inevitable defeat, represented the highest form of honour that transcended success or failure to achieve moral victory over circumstances that could not be materially overcome. The Norse tradition of oral storytelling served functions that extended far beyond entertainment to encompass education, spiritual guidance, legal precedent, psychological healing, and the preservation of cultural wisdom across generations that lacked writing systems capable of recording the full complexity of their knowledge and values. The skaldic tradition that created complex poetic forms requiring extensive training and exceptional skill served as technology for preserving precise information about historical events, genealogical relationships, legal obligations, and spiritual practices in forms that were both artistically satisfying and practically useful for community decision-making and cultural transmission. The psychological sophistication of traditional stories lay in their ability to embed multiple levels of meaning within narratives that could be appreciated by audiences possessing different degrees of knowledge and experience. Children could enjoy the surface adventures, while adults recognized deeper patterns and implications that provided guidance for navigating complex personal and social challenges. The communal nature of storytelling created opportunities for shared cultural experience that reinforced collective identity, while also allowing for individual interpretation and application of traditional wisdom to contemporary circumstances. The storyteller served as intermediary between ancient wisdom and present needs, translating eternal patterns into forms that addressed immediate concerns. The memorization techniques required for preserving extensive oral traditions created mental disciplines that enhanced individual psychological development, while also creating human repositories of cultural knowledge who could maintain continuity during periods of social disruption or geographical displacement. These individuals represented living libraries whose loss could devastate entire communities. The seasonal timing of storytelling activities created rhythms of cultural transmission that aligned education with natural cycles and social patterns in ways that enhanced both retention and relevance of traditional knowledge. The long winter nights provided ideal conditions for sharing stories that prepared younger generations for adult responsibilities and spiritual understanding. The integration of storytelling with ritual activities, ceremonial occasions, and religious observances created contexts where narrative and spiritual practice reinforced each other to produce experiences that transformed consciousness while also preserving cultural continuity. These combined activities represented sophisticated technologies for human development that operated simultaneously on individual and collective levels. The Norse understanding of ordinary activities as potentially sacred practices created frameworks for spiritual development that did not require withdrawal from practical responsibilities, but rather involved bringing appropriate consciousness and intention to whatever tasks circumstances required. This integration of spiritual and material concerns reflected understanding that consciousness could be transformed through any activity performed with dedication and awareness. The agricultural work that sustained Norse communities was understood as participation in cosmic cycles of creation and renewal rather than mere economic necessity. The seasonal activities of planting, cultivating, harvesting, and preservation connected human communities with natural forces while also providing opportunities for ritual observance and community cooperation that strengthened social bonds and cultural identity. The craftsmanship that produced tools, weapons, clothing, buildings, and other necessities for community life was recognized as spiritual practice when performed with appropriate skill, dedication, and respect for materials and traditions. Master craftspeople often possessed supernatural assistance or divine inspiration that enabled them to achieve results that transcended ordinary technical competence. The domestic activities that maintained households and families, cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, textile production, and countless other tasks typically assigned to women, were understood as essential spiritual work that created the conditions within which other forms of achievement became possible. The sacred dimension of domestic labour was recognized through its association with goddesses and female spiritual powers. The trading and travelling that connected Norse communities with distant cultures and resources provided opportunities for spiritual as well as material exchange. Merchants and travellers often served as intermediaries who brought not only goods but also knowledge, stories, and spiritual practices that enriched the communities they visited. The legal and political activities that maintained social order and resolved conflicts were understood as participation in cosmic justice, rather than merely human convention. The assemblies where legal decisions were made served as ritual occasions where divine principles were applied to human circumstances through community deliberation and consensus. The military activities that protected communities and extended their influence were recognized as spiritual practice when conducted according to proper principles of honor, courage, and respect for worthy opponents. Warfare at its best represented cosmic struggle between order and chaos rather than mere competition for material resources. The Norse understanding of individual development as participation in cosmic processes of manifestation and consciousness evolution created frameworks for child rearing and education that honoured both individual potential and collective needs, while also acknowledging the spiritual dimensions of human growth and learning. The moment of birth was understood as the entry of spiritual consciousness into material form, rather than simple biological event. The ceremonies that welcomed new children into communities included recognition of their spiritual nature and invocation of divine protection for the challenges they would face during their earthly existence. The naming practices that connected individual identity with family history, mythological precedents, and spiritual aspirations demonstrated understanding that personal identity was not arbitrary creation, but participation in larger patterns of meaning and purpose that extended across generations and cultural boundaries. The coming-of-age rituals that marked transition from childhood to adult responsibility included spiritual as well as practical elements that prepared young people for the psychological and moral challenges they would face as full members of communities that depended on their contributions for survival and prosperity. The educational processes that transmitted cultural knowledge, practical skills, and spiritual understanding operated through apprenticeship relationships that created personal bonds between teachers and students, while also ensuring that essential knowledge would be preserved and adapted to serve contemporary needs and circumstances. The recognition of individual gifts and talents as divine endowments that carried corresponding obligations created psychological frameworks that encouraged excellence, while also emphasizing service to collective welfare rather than merely personal advancement or achievement. Exceptional abilities were understood as trusts that required appropriate stewardship. The integration of play and learning in childhood development reflected understanding that consciousness naturally sought knowledge and skill through activities that provided pleasure and satisfaction, rather than merely discipline and obligation. The games and stories that entertained children also prepared them for adult roles and responsibilities. The gradual assumption of adult responsibilities through participation in family and community activities created developmental processes that built confidence and competence, while also maintaining connections with support systems that could provide guidance and assistance during difficult transitions or challenging circumstances. The Norse recognition of dreams as communications from supernatural realms rather than merely psychological phenomena created systematic approaches to dream interpretation and visionary experience that served practical functions for individual guidance and community decision-making, while also providing access to forms of knowledge unavailable through ordinary sensory experience. The prophetic dreams that warned of future dangers or revealed hidden opportunities were understood as gifts from divine sources that required appropriate interpretation and response to be effective. These dreams often came to individuals who possessed special sensitivity or who held positions of responsibility that made such guidance essential for community welfare. The visitation dreams, where spirits of the dead communicated with living relatives or friends, provided evidence for continued existence after physical death, while also enabling practical exchange of information and guidance that could influence material circumstances. These dreams created ongoing relationships between living and dead that maintained family and community continuity across generations. The healing dreams that provided knowledge about medicinal plants, therapeutic techniques, or spiritual causes of disease served practical medical functions, while also demonstrating the integration of physical and spiritual approaches to health and healing. These dreams often came to individuals who served as healers or wise women in their communities. The warning dreams that alerted individuals to hidden dangers, treacherous associates, or approaching disasters served protective functions that could save lives and prevent catastrophes when properly interpreted and acted upon. These dreams required careful analysis to distinguish between literal and symbolic content. The teaching dreams, where supernatural beings provided instruction in magical techniques, ritual practices, or spiritual principles, served educational functions that complemented but also transcended ordinary forms of learning and cultural transmission. These dreams often came to individuals who had become spiritual leaders or practitioners of specialized arts. The initiation dreams that mark transitions between different levels of spiritual development or social responsibility often involve symbolic death and rebirth experiences that transformed consciousness in ways that prepared individuals for new roles and capabilities. These dreams served as internal ceremonies that complemented external ritual activities. The collective dreams that came to multiple individuals simultaneously, or that conveyed similar messages to different people, provided validation for supernatural communications, while also ensuring that important information would not be lost due to individual death, incapacity, or failure to understand the significance of dream content. The Norse understanding of sound as spiritual force, capable of influencing material circumstances and consciousness, states, created sophisticated approaches to vocal practice, musical performance, and acoustic design that served both practical and sacred functions within community life and religious observance. The Galda tradition of magical chanting and incantation utilized specific vocal techniques, rhythmic patterns, and sound combinations to influence weather, heal diseases, provide protection, and communicate with supernatural beings. These practices required extensive training and spiritual preparation to be effective, while also creating forms of oral artistry that served aesthetic as well as magical functions. The use of horns, drums, and other instruments in religious ceremonies and community celebrations created soundscapes that enhanced ritual effectiveness, while also providing opportunities for collective participation in sacred activities. The acoustic properties of these instruments were understood to operate on spiritual as well as physical levels. The architectural design of halls and other gathering spaces took into account acoustic principles that enhanced the effectiveness of storytelling, musical performance, and oratory, while also creating environments that supported the community, functions these spaces were designed to serve. The great halls of kings and heroes were as much performance venues as residential or governmental facilities. The integration of vocal techniques with breathing practices and meditation created systematic approaches to consciousness alteration that enabled access to visionary states and enhanced spiritual capabilities. These techniques were often closely guarded secrets transmitted only to appropriate students through direct personal instruction. The use of silence as spiritual practice rather than mere absence of sound created frameworks for contemplation and inner development that complemented the more active forms of religious and magical practice. The ability to maintain appropriate silence was considered as important as the ability to speak with power and precision. The recognition that certain sounds and words possessed inherent power that operated independently of their linguistic meaning created approaches to language that honoured the magical as well as communicative dimensions of speech. Sacred words and formulas required proper pronunciation and intention to be effective, while also needing protection from casual or inappropriate use. The seasonal and daily rhythms of sound that characterized Norse communities, the morning calls that awakened the settlement, the work songs that coordinated group activities, the evening stories that prepared for sleep, created acoustic environments that supported both practical activities and spiritual awareness. As we reach the culmination of our journey through the vast landscape of Norse mythological consciousness, we find ourselves not at an ending, but at a recognition of the eternal present moment, where all the wisdom, beauty, and terrible honesty of this ancient tradition continues to live and breathe, offering its gifts to any consciousness willing to receive them with appropriate openness and courage. The Norse understanding that time was cyclical rather than linear, that destruction enabled renewal, that endings were also beginnings, created frameworks for experiencing existence as eternal dance between manifestation and dissolution, creation and destruction, learning and forgetting, that gave cosmic significance to individual choices while also placing them within contexts that transcended personal understanding or control. The recognition that consciousness itself was both mortal and eternal, mortal in its particular manifestations but eternal in its essential nature and capacity for transformation, provided psychological frameworks that could embrace both the reality of death and the continuity of awareness that made such death meaningful rather than merely terminal. Death represented transition rather than cessation, graduation rather than failure. The integration of tragic and heroic elements within single vision created approaches to existence that could acknowledge limitation and loss without succumbing to despair, that could face uncertainty and difficulty without abandoning purpose and meaning, that could maintain dignity and joy even while fully accepting the mortal conditions that made such dignity and joy both precious and temporary. The psychological sophistication that characterized Norse approaches to consciousness, relationship, meaning, and spiritual development continues to offer resources for contemporary individuals and communities seeking frameworks for understanding existence that honor both its beauty and its difficulty, both its possibilities and its limitations, both its individual and collective dimensions. In these final moments of contemplation, as consciousness prepares to return from mythological realms to immediate circumstances, the Norse voices offer their ultimate gift, the understanding that existence is sacred not because it is permanent, but because it is temporary, meaningful not because it is secure, but because it is uncertain, precious, not because it is possessed, but because it is shared, and beautiful not despite its tragic dimensions, but because of the courage and grace with which consciousness meets whatever destiny awaits in the eternal mystery that is life itself. The great tree Yggdrasil continues to stand in the realm of imagination and memory, its roots drawing from wells of wisdom and possibility, while its branches support all the worlds where consciousness continues its eternal adventure of discovering meaning within limitation, beauty within transience, purpose within the knowledge of its own mortality. The Norse vision reminds us that such knowledge is not obstacle to meaning but the very condition that makes meaning possible, not burden to be escaped, but gift to be received with the gratitude and courage that consciousness at its best can offer. As the northern lights fade into dawn and consciousness returns to the immediate world of waking responsibilities and daily choices, the wisdom of the Norse remains eternally present, available in the moment when courage is needed to face difficulty, when wisdom is required to navigate complexity, when grace is called for to accept limitation, and when joy is possible despite uncertainty. In this eternal now, where all possibilities converge, the ancient voices continue their patient teaching, that existence is adventure rather than problem, that consciousness is gift rather than burden, and that the appropriate response to the mystery of being is not understanding but wonder, not control but participation, not escape but embrace of the magnificent and terrible dance that is life itself. The Norse understanding of water as medium for spiritual transformation and cosmic communication created complex relationships with rivers, lakes, springs, and seas that transcended their practical functions to encompass ritual purification, supernatural encounter, and connection with divine sources of wisdom and power that flowed through natural waterways like blood through the veins of a living cosmos. The wells that provided access to different forms of cosmic knowledge, Urda's well where the Norns determined fate, Mimir's well that offered wisdom through sacrifice, and Vergelmir that bubbled with the primordial forces from which all existence emerged, represented different approaches to understanding that required different forms of preparation and payment to access effectively. The ritual offerings deposited in bogs, lakes and rivers throughout Scandinavia, weapons, jewellery, coins and other valuable objects deliberately sacrificed to supernatural powers dwelling beneath the surface, provided archaeological evidence for religious practices that recognised water as dwelling place for divine beings who required appropriate acknowledgement and compensation for their assistance and protection. The sacred springs associated with healing properties, prophetic inspiration, or magical transformation created focal points for pilgrimage and ritual observance that connected local communities with cosmic sources of renewal and guidance. The waters from such springs were often considered too powerful for casual use, requiring ceremonial approach and respectful handling to avoid spiritual contamination or divine displeasure. The psychology of water ritual reflected understanding that consciousness, like water, possessed fluid properties that enabled transformation and purification through appropriate ceremonial practices. Ritual bathing, blessing with sacred water, and ceremonial washing before important activities created technologies for consciousness alteration that prepared individuals for supernatural encounter or enhanced spiritual capability. The rivers that served as boundaries between different realms of existence, between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, between human territory and giant country, between familiar and unknown regions, required special knowledge and protection to cross safely. These waterways were not merely geographical features but spiritual boundaries that marked transitions between different states of being and levels of reality. The sea, vast and unpredictable, represented the ultimate challenge to human understanding and control, while also providing the medium through which Norse communities extended their influence across enormous geographical distances. The ocean embodied both terrible destructive power and generous abundance, both insurmountable obstacle and pathway to opportunity and adventure. The ships that enabled Norse exploration and expansion were understood as more than transportation technology, but as spiritual vessels capable of carrying consciousness between different worlds and different states of existence. The ship burials that marked the graves of important individuals provided these spiritual vessels for journeys into death that paralleled the ocean voyages that had characterized their mortal existence. The Norse understanding of exile as spiritual transformation, rather than mere punishment, created frameworks where separation from community became opportunity for consciousness to discover its deepest resources. The outlaw who survived exile often returned with enhanced wisdom and capabilities earned through direct encounter with forces that tested every aspect of character. This psychology of displacement revealed that consciousness required periodic separation from comfort to achieve its full potential, whether through legal exile, voluntary pilgrimage, or divine calling. The wandering heroes embodied the principle that creativity and insight often emerged from experiences of difficulty and displacement that forced awareness beyond ordinary limitations. The outlaw poet, the exiled king, the wandering sage possessed perspectives unavailable to those who remained within conventional boundaries. Yet return from exile required not merely geographical homecoming, but psychological reintegration that could incorporate hard-won wisdom with community relationships, often proving more challenging than the original separation. Earth, air, fire, and water were understood as spiritual forces rather than mere substances, each possessing characteristics that required understanding and respect. Earth represented manifestation, the stable foundation enabling spiritual forces to take material form through agricultural collaboration and sacred landscape modification. Air embodied communication and inspiration, providing the medium through which consciousness extended beyond physical limits via breath, speech, and the Galdra magic that projected intention into reality. Fire served as both destroyer and creator, purifying what was no longer needed while enabling new forms of creation. The sacred fires of temples and funeral pyres facilitated transformation between different states of being rather than mere destruction. Water represented emotional and spiritual flow, enabling consciousness to navigate between different states while connecting all beings within shared hydrological cycles that demonstrated existence's fundamental interdependence. The Norse recognized certain mental disturbances as evidence of supernatural contact, requiring careful interpretation rather than simple pathology. Berserker fury, prophetic madness, and poetic inspiration represented forms of consciousness alteration that accessed non-human sources of capability, sacred states, requiring management to prevent damage when they ended. The relationship between spiritual sensitivity and mental vulnerability created understanding that individuals capable of supernatural experience often possess psychological characteristics, making them susceptible to both beneficial and harmful influences. This led to protective practices and support systems enabling sensitive individuals to serve community functions while maintaining stability. The distinction between genuine spiritual experience and mere disturbance required trained observation, enabling communities to benefit from supernatural guidance while protecting vulnerable members. Family relationships represented spiritual as well as biological connections, creating complex systems of mutual obligation extending across generations. Family honor made individual action significant for all relatives, living and dead, creating motivations for excellence that transcended self-interest while providing mutual support networks. Inheritance transmitted not only material wealth, but spiritual obligations, family luck, and ancestral wisdom, maintaining cultural continuity across time and space. Blood brotherhood rituals demonstrated that spiritual bonds could equal biological connections through appropriate ceremony and maintained loyalty. Family spirits provided invisible support networks, while creating obligations for ritual observance that honored ancestral wisdom. The genealogical consciousness enabling recitation of ancestry served practical purposes while providing spiritual connections with mythological and divine dimensions of family history. Norse healing addressed harmony between spiritual and physical existence, recognizing that effective treatment required attention to relationships, spiritual obligations, and cosmic alignments alongside medical intervention. Healers combined herbal knowledge with ritual procedures and consciousness alteration, possessing supernatural perception, enabling diagnosis of conditions invisible to ordinary observation. The healer-patient relationship involved spiritual partnership, requiring mutual trust and shared commitment to restoration. Death was understood as transformation rather than termination, creating frameworks enabling dignity and purpose in approaching mortality. Preparation involved conscious cultivation of qualities enabling appropriate response when death arrived, developing courage, maintaining honor, accumulating worthy deeds. Death rituals facilitated transition while serving community needs, providing equipment for posthumous existence, and creating immortality through cultural memory that preserved individual identity beyond biological limitation. Love operated as cosmic force rather than mere emotion, acknowledging both transformative power and tragic dimensions within conditions of mortality. The great love stories, Sigurd and Brynhild, Sigyn and Loki, Freyja and Oda, demonstrated how authentic connection could transcend social convention while creating consequences affecting entire communities. Genuine affection required choosing beloved's welfare over personal security, accepting powerlessness over their choices, while maintaining commitment that could survive separation and death. The integration of physical passion with spiritual partnership recognized bodily pleasure as divine gift, while acknowledging that relationships carried cosmic consequences, requiring attention to universal principles and social obligations. Love's seasonal nature included periods of closeness and distance as natural aspects of deep relationship, creating realistic expectations that sustained connection through difficulty while appreciating moments of intimacy. As our exploration of Norse consciousness approaches completion, we find not final answers but deepened appreciation for questions resonating across centuries, providing frameworks honoring both beauty and complexity, joy and sorrow. The Norse vision of existence as cosmic adventure offers resources as relevant today as for the communities that first shaped these insights about reality's nature and our place within it. The recognition that wisdom comes through experience, courage through facing difficulty, love through commitment, and meaning through engagement creates approaches sustaining individuals and communities through whatever existence presents. The integration of individual development with collective welfare demonstrates how consciousness maintains coherence while participating in processes transcending personal understanding. In these final moments, the Norse voices offer ultimate teaching. Existence is mystery to be lived rather than problem to be solved, gift to be received with grace and courage rather than burden to endure, adventure to be embraced with full heart, mind, and spirit. The great tree Yggdrasil continues supporting all worlds, where consciousness explores its depths and heights, limitations and potentials. As the wheel turns and existence continues its eternal rhythm, we carry these northern lights of wisdom into our own time, knowing the insights received are gifts to be shared, living wisdom to be applied creatively with courage, love, and recognition, that we too participate in the magnificent and mysterious adventure that is existence itself.